I don't think it's at all fair or reasonable that low and middle income taxpayers should be subsidising property investors. I've got nothing against property investment, but I don't think other people should be forced to subsidise it through our tax system. Negative gearing is something that has been proposed to be removed in one form or another for many, many years, and we're acting on the advice of pretty senior economists, advocates, groups like ACOS, National Shelter and many others, who have been saying for years that negative gearing distorts our property market and it really privileges investors and prices first home buyers out of the market. So we believe it's a really important reform. Negative gearing has comprehensively failed as a way of introducing new supply into the Australian property market. What we would like to see is the $3 billion that this reform would raise over the next 4 years going into emergency accommodation for people experiencing homelessness and to getting families, 7,500 families, off the social housing waiting list around the country with new supply. So I think it's time for Mr Hockey to maybe open his eyes, take another look at the evidence, not just from the Australian Greens, but from people right across the housing affordability sector, and acknowledge also that the Australian Labor Party has said some encouraging things, particularly Mr Bowen in the last couple of weeks. It's time that negative gearing was abolished.
Senator, one of the arguments against scrapping negative gearing is that it actually creates homes for people to live in. Why do you think that your plan would your plan actually continue to do that? Is it going to create more houses, or is it actually going to shrink the market?
Well, when negative gearing first really took off, it was argued that it would increase housing supply, and it's comprehensively failed because the overwhelming majority of negatively geared properties are ones that investors have bought. They haven't built them. So there is an issue with housing supply in this country, and it's one of the reasons why markets are so overheated. Well, we think that a better use of taxpayers' money than people subsidising property investors is to simply build new housing. So we propose housing stock for people experiencing homelessness. We believe within 5 years, by 2020, we've costed that you could actually house every rough sleeper in the country. That's 7,000 dwellings. And also take 7,500 people off the social housing waiting list. That's a supply-side initiative that would actually work.
One of the other arguments has been that it would increase rents as investors try to make up the shortfall.
Well, effectively, those arguments have been debunked. And we have a period in the 1990s when negative gearing was taken out of the system for a short period of time. And the mythology really is that it increased rents, and of course it did no such thing. Rents were going up in Sydney and Perth because of very, very low rental vacancy rates. They stayed flat in Melbourne, they actually went down in Brisbane. So we think the evidence is overwhelmingly in favour of scrapping negative gearing.
Was that in the 80s under Labor?
It was under Keating.
So many mum and dad investors have made their wealth through negative gearing. Do you think the two major parties would be slightly hesitant to change anything to do with negative gearing because of the reaction they'll get from the public?
Look, we've got no problem at all with property investment. It's just that people shouldn't be forced to subsidise it through their taxes. That's one of the reasons that we've proposed grandfathering arrangements, which say, effective the 1st of July, we think negative gearing should stop, but we're not going to penalise people who've already structured their financial affairs that way.
Have you actually done any economic modelling on what impact your plan would actually have taking up negative gearing?
Well, yeah, we have. So the Parliamentary Budget Office has modelled how much revenue you could raise, and they've modelled behavioural change for sort of the first 10 years of a scheme that assumes that the tax concession gradually unwinds over a period of 10 years or so. So what they estimated was that over a 10-year period it actually raises $42 billion. Now that can go back into hospitals and schools. Crucially, we believe it should go back into housing affordability.
Another housing issue, on another real estate issue, is there a housing bubble, do you think, in Sydney and Melbourne?
Well, we saw in budget estimates last week, in response to questions by my colleague Senator Whish-Wilson, the Treasury Secretary said unambiguously yes in Sydney, pointed to the overheated state of the market in Melbourne. We saw similar conditions here in Perth during the heat of the mining boom. I think the evidence is very squarely on the table, and that's a very dangerous situation for Australia to be in.
There have been reports about questionable dealings, particularly with Chinese investors and mansions in the Sydney real estate market. That's despite a toughening of the laws. Are the Greens concerned about this issue?
Well, we are concerned if the law is being broken, but the fact is property investment at the real top end of the market by overseas investors has no impact at all on housing affordability for the vast majority of people who are either trying to get into their first home or dealing with skyrocketing rents. You know, the sale of mansions to Chinese investors is hardly going to affect them.
On another issue, the issue of revoking citizenship for dual nationals, is that something that you think Australia should be doing, or what sort of concerns do you have?
I think that idea has to be treated with extraordinary care. The government appears to be just systematically wrong-footing itself with these proposals that come half-hatched and half-baked into the public domain in an attempt to appear tough. There's obviously no consensus within the Prime Minister's own party room, and one of the perverse consequences, I think, is that you're conceivably dumping really dangerous people in other jurisdictions or in neighbouring countries where police, law enforcement and security agencies won't be as able or as prepared to deal with them. There's obviously a very severe security issue at stake here, but simply dumping people off in other jurisdictions is not necessarily the best way to go. But we would like to see a much more measured debate about sensible ways of keeping Australians safe.
Have the Greens thought of any, come up with any alternatives that they could put to Parliament? Is there any, have they considered special prisons or?
No, look, the alternatives that the Greens have put into the mix mostly are around prevention, rather than the sort of extraordinary overemphasis that we're seeing on surveillance and tracking of people while the Prime Minister takes us into yet another war in the Middle East, is that we need to be looking at de-radicalisation and why people, and increasingly younger people, are being drawn to these hideous ideologies. And there's good advice and there's good policy work being done, including here in Western Australia, on how to prevent kids from being seduced by some of the sick ideologies that have emerged.
Do you think IS is a big threat to Australia?
I don't think it's a threat to Australia. I think it's an extraordinary threat to neighbouring countries in the region. And yes, like individuals coming back from that conflict zone, having been exposed to these ideologies with post-traumatic stress, there's no question that they could conceivably present a security risk. But whether Islamic State overall represents an existential threat to Australia, it doesn't. It's a security risk. It needs to be dealt with. We don't want to see some of the tactics that the government is adopting potentially making things worse by polarising and dividing people rather than uniting the Australian community.
In the papers today, Bill Shorten is saying that Labor will campaign to remove the GST on tampons, and this is after sort of new research that's come to light from the Parliamentary Budget Office showing that states would only lose $75 million over 4 years, but that by broadening the GST to include digital downloads, they will, such as the Netflix tax, they'll raise $350 million. So it could easily be made up. It could be saved up in that way. Is that something the Greens would support?
We want to take a look at the numbers, and in a way I'd almost want to keep the argument separate. Like with whatever you do via tax reform, whether it be negative gearing or broadening the GST, the argument that tampons should be subject to the GST, I think, is unsupportable. So in whatever way you want to make up the small amount of revenue, I think it's a pretty strong argument.
Also in the paper today, there's a year 3 student who Peter Betts doesn't believe should be registered as a girl.
Yeah.
Actually a boy. What's your thoughts on that?
To be really honest, I think politicians should stay out of debates like that. I did see some sensible commentary by Peter Collier, but I don't think Mr Abetts' comments are helpful. I think it should be left to the principals and the school staff, the parents, and most importantly to the child who's at the centre. And I don't think turning it into a political debate is necessarily going to serve the interests of those children.
How would you say what would you say to parents who are being introduced to this, I guess, the transgender issue that's coming out into the media, publicly whenever it's really pushing it forward and becoming more mainstream? What would you say to parents about who are concerned about these things, talking to their kids and understanding that at the end of the day, you just need to accept people for who they are?
Yeah. Well, look, I'm not a parent, so I'd be the last person wanting to advise parents on how to deal with their kids. I think the way the debate is maturing is helpful because the stigma and the taboo is being removed, and that can't but be a good thing. So again, I would just ask politicians to step back, let the headmaster, let the parents and let the child sort this issue out without commentary from politicians from any side.
feeling now that you've kind of settled into the new leadership?
Good. We're feeling good. The new team have settled in. We're in a process of staff recruitment, and I'm actually really enjoying working with Larissa and with Richard in that capacity. The negative gearing initiative is the first major costed policy that we've launched since the leadership change. And Christine Milne is looking as though a weight has lifted from her shoulders. And so I think it's an extraordinary tribute to Christine that we're this well placed. We've got our highest ever parliamentary representation in the state parliaments and in federal parliament. Our membership's growing. It was nice to see Christine looking like she'd had some proper night's sleep.